Hi guys, I'm sorry I'm not in class with you guys today, but I'm just down the hall in the Media Center doing elective registration with everybody. However, we do need to finish some notes from the last time I saw you guys, which would have been on Thursday last week. You should have just taken your quiz, your second quiz over the unit. What I want to do today is we're going to finish up some notes on the political history of Nigeria, and then you're going to do some preliminary work for me on the political regime of Nigeria, the current governmental structure. That'll set you up for your Harkness discussion, which is occurring the next time I see you. Your Harkness reading coming up is on the 1999 Constitution of Nigeria and how it was created and some problems that came out of it. You only have a portion of that article to read. If you are interested, however, I can give you a link to the full article. It's pretty lengthy, but if you're into this sort of thing, it might be interesting for you. Now, I believe my two classes today, both of you guys stopped your lecture in a slightly different place. So I'm going to start right after the last notes on British imperialism that we took are. So if your class is a little bit further ahead than this, feel free to skip ahead in the video till we get to the point that you're not up on. So when we left off, or I'm just going to kind of work off of this, when we left off with regards to British imperialism, we kind of left off in the middle of the 20th century. So British imperialism really is kind of formulated in Nigeria as of 1861 with the creation of a colonial sphere of influence around Lagos, and then the push inward kind of consolidated under the Berlin Conference of 1884-85. Now, British imperialism took on a different character after the end of World War II, in part because of the Atlantic Charter from 1941, which we've talked about in the past. Remember, that's the declaration that basically said that all peoples have the right to self-determination. So at the end of World War II, there's this kind of acknowledgement on the part of the British Empire that if there aren't substantial changes made to the way that the British administer their empire in places like Nigeria, it's entirely possible that they could be facing violent opposition. So, one thing that we see after World War II is an increase in the amount of civil society organizations. Britain, to give them credit with regards to Nigeria, do not prohibit the formation of political parties. So you have the National Council of Nigerian Citizens, the NCNC, develop. And initially, this organization, which is founded by Benjamin Ndam, I'm going to screw this up, in Nnamdi Ezekwe, that's not too hard. He is a person who's been educated in the United States. He has a PhD. He comes back to Nigeria after World War II. He founds a newspaper, and he founds the National Council on Nigerian Citizens to essentially be a sort of universal nationalistic political party that is supposed to sort of appeal to Nigerians of all different ethnicities. However, the NCNC becomes primarily a political party or associated with the Igbo. And remember, they're a group in the southeast of Nigeria. They worked a lot with the British. They were primarily Christian, and they did not have a whole lot to do with, say, like the Hausa and Fulani, or even the Yoruba. Then you had other political groups originate during this period as well, like the Northern People's Congress. That is mostly associated with the Hausa group up in the north, as well as the Action Group Party, the AGP, which is from the southwest. It's primarily Yoruba. Now, the British really did try to kind of like prevent what they felt like would be sort of losing control of Nigeria as a whole if it kind of like devolved into civil war. So because they were trying to hold on to this big block of land that they were referring to as Nigeria, even though it contained quite a lot of different ethnic and cultural and linguistic groups, they were trying to hold on to it as though it were one unified polity. So the government structure that the British start imposing at the end of the 20th century as a means of trying to kind of sustain this idea of a nation state in West Africa here is something called decentralized federalism. It's very similar to the idea of asymmetrical federalism that we saw in, say, Russia. it basically devolves an awful lot of power to the local level, particularly in the north. So what we see here is this weird moment where we have this kind of rising idea of nationalism, of that Nigeria should be an independent nation. So you have this rising idea of nationalism at the same time that you have this like rising idea of like preserving the differences in regions. So you have this increasingly regional sort of way of thinking about each other. So like the Igbo aren't talking to the Hausa, aren't talking to the Yoruba, aren't talking to the Fulani. And that's not really a great thing. So what we have are these autonomous regions develop in the north, the west, and the east during the late 40s into the 1950s. Now, the goal ultimately by the 1950s for the British is to establish Nigeria as an independent state, however, with remaining ties to the British Empire as a whole, and that Nigeria would then become part of the British Commonwealth. It would have self-governance, it would essentially be autonomous, it would be independent, but it would be part of the larger British Commonwealth. So like think of it like Australia. Australia is fully independent, they make their own decisions. However, technically the Queen is still their head of state and they are still part of the British Commonwealth. So that was the idea, that Nigeria would still be part of this greater British Commonwealth, and that would give the UK still some access to a lot of Nigeria's resources, including oil. So during this 1950s period, kind of leading up to independence, there is a formal federal structure emerging that the British put in place, and they officially divide up Nigeria into 3 regions: northern, western, and eastern. The northern is by far the largest portion in terms of square miles. However, in terms of population, it's still it's less than, say, either the west or the east. This sort of forming government system has a House of Representatives, which is directly elected. So like the northern region would be divided up into districts, and it's an SMD system, single member districting. So everybody elects their local representative. And then you would also have local assemblies per district. And out of those local assemblies, you would elect your senators. So senators aren't directly elected. You would elect the assembly, and then the assembly would elect the senator. It's sort of how we did things here in the US up until what, the 13th is 23rd, I can't remember, until we changed the amendment and basically allowed for the direct election of senators. There was a position established for Governor General, which would essentially be sort of like the Crown's representative in Nigeria, the idea being that this be a Nigerian person rather than, say, a British royal governor. The first Governor General is Ezekwe, the fellow who founded the NCNC. Now, just a little bit of background on him. He's an interesting fellow. He is from the southeast in terms of his heritage. However, he was raised in the north and actually grew up speaking Hausa. And that kind of colored how he saw the NCNC initially. He really thought that it would be entirely possible to create sort of like this pan-Nigerian identity. And unfortunately, that just didn't happen for him. Now, so that's the basic structure of the government that is established prior to the British leaving in 1960. So Nigeria becomes an independent nation as of October 1st, 1960. It's really not a violent transition. There are a few protests, a few skirmishes, but it is not a violent transition. It's nothing like, say, the independence movements in Algeria with the French, or say what occurs in India. India is kind of held up as this model of peaceful transition, but the fact of the matter is it's terribly violent when you talk about the migrations of people from northern India into Pakistan and Pakistan into northern India. Nigeria is way less contentious than any of that. So it really was a fairly peaceable transition. So this is what the initial Nigerian republic looks like, the first republic. You can see here that the northern region, this big district up here, it is quite huge in terms of its space. But like when you look at its population, yeah, it's like 16.8 million people. That's a lot. But like if you look at the size relative to like the western region and the eastern region, those are both really tiny regions. And in terms of population, like proportionally, frankly, this is very clearly much more sparsely populated. So there are three major regions in the First Republic, and then Lagos is the federal district. This is where the capital was. So the current capital of Nigeria is what? Hopefully you're saying Abuja, which is like right here. But Lagos being the initial territory of sort of the British, this is where the center of power is, and thus that becomes the first capital. Now, this right here is the ceremony for the handover on October 1st, 1960. This is Princess Alexandra. She was a member of the royal family. They did not send Queen Elizabeth II. She was busy. This is the Governor General. This is Ezekwe. He will eventually become Nigeria's first president. Also, this gentleman is really dapper, and I like his outfit. Okay. All right. So I'm going to kind of rush through this here. I don't mean to be like, you know, like kind of rush this off, but frankly, what we really do need to do is focus on modern Nigeria, but it is important to kind of talk through the structure here. So initially, when we look at Nigerian independence, there's a lot to be optimistic about as of 1960. First of all, there's the peaceable transition. Like, that is always a plus. There was no major civil war or anything that they needed to rebuild from. The other fact is that because the British kind of planned their exit, there was actually kind of some plans in terms of development and industrialization. The British, I really don't want to kind of paint too rosy of a picture. They did do some pretty terrible things while occupying Nigeria. But post-World War II, they really did make some efforts at building up infrastructure and increasing, say, access to education, etc. So there was some promise for development. There was definitely some promise for industrialization. Nigeria had the potential to have really strong exports, and they certainly had oil revenue. Put a star by that one. That one's super important. But there were problems. There were lots of problems. In the first major elections that were held even prior to the independence movement, particularly the elections of 1957, because they wanted to have the legislature sort of up and running before independence took full effect. What we saw was that, 1959. I screwed up my dates there. What we start to see is that there's some serious problems in terms of representation and dominance here. So the NPC, which is the Northern Party, that's the Hausa Party, they won half of the seats in the House of Representatives in 1959, and they formed an alliance in a bizarre twist of fate with the NCNC, the Igbo Party. Now that sounds weird on its front here, because the Hausa are primarily Muslim, they're up north, they really don't have a lot in common with the Igbo, who are mostly Christian, and they're down south. But what they could do then is unite against the Yoruba group, the AGP. Okay, so they unite against the AGP, which is more strongly associated with the Yoruba. The AGP then fragmented, and it led to a series of significant disputes and infighting that ultimately in 1960 and 61 led to the collapse of the regional legislature, which is not good. Ultimately, this meant that the central government of Nigeria had to establish emergency protocols. They basically had to take over local, regional, and assembly governance, and sort of suspend local governance for a period of time as a result of this. So because you had these two major parties that came to kind of choke out other minority parties, you had these fragments develop over in the Yoruba region, the southwest, and that really led to a lot of instability early on in the Nigerian state. Now I've got about 30 seconds before I run out of recording time on this one, so I'm going to stop it here. You'll need to move on to the next video, and hopefully I'll finish that one up in just a couple of minutes. All right, so see you on the other side.